but we are pleased to have in the studio tonight the co-authors of a most interesting read. It's called Great Expectations, The Lost Toronto Blue Jays Season. Shai Davidi and John Lott are with us in studio. Under normal circumstances, I'll be honest with you, I'd have taken a look at this book, leafed through it, and probably put it in the pile of other books that come out this time of year and figure I'll get to it later on. But for whatever reason, I started reading a few at the beginning of it and got through about half of it before I could put it down. So, and I don't do that very often.
He doesn't do that ever.
So congratulations on keeping my attention. And so I do recommend it for anybody who's a Blue Jay fan, and for a lot of reasons. But I don't know how many fans will really relish the thought of looking back on this season that was so painful. But at the same time, you answered a lot of questions as to how they got to that point. When did you decide that this was a good year to go down this road?
I'm thinking when it was a different year than it turned out to be.
That's right.
Just a guess.
Well, last year. It turned out to be last year, didn't it? Because actually it was Jack David of ECW Press called and said he thought this was a good idea. And, of course, this was right on the heels of the Dickey trade. And so
this would have been during the wintertime.
This was in December, yeah.
So this was going to be the Triumphal March to the World Series book.
Yeah.
That's what we thought.
Yeah, so did a lot of us thought that.
I think that was part of the beauty of the title, respectfully borrowed from Charles Dickens. But, it fit no matter what happened, no matter which way the seasons went. And that was part of the challenge for us, was figuring out, how do we write this without knowing that it's actually going to play out the way we think it is? And how do we structure this? And we built it progressively to be ready shortly after the season ended, no matter what happened. So we ended up settling on this structure of building it around the various individuals and, wrapping around what happened in and around their backstories.
So with the first few chapters where you document more or less what happened during the off season last year, the acquisitions, the pursuit of a guy like PV that didn't materialize, all of those things, that would have been in there under any circumstance. Yeah.
I mean, I think the beginning is, that's the start of the story. And if you look at the way the book's structured, it's essentially a one-year snapshot. It sort of begins on the final day of the 2012 season and what the Blue Jays did to get prepared, a little bit of the Farrell saga leading into the off season and everything that progressed, and it ends on the final day of the 2013 season. And it would have been after a playoffs had they made it that far, or after the World Series if they made it that far. But unfortunately, that never materialized.
Well, but I think you and everybody else knew by May, June that you knew which direction this thing was going to go.
I was going to ask you, when did you, because you guys, between the two of you, probably spent as much time, covered at as many games as anybody, I would think. What were your personal sinking feeling in my gut moment that this is not going to pan out?
Jose Reyes getting hurt.
Yeah.
I think that we knew which way this was going to go, certainly by early May. So there was that moment in time in June when they won 11 games in a row. But as we say in the book, there were so many pieces of that streak that showed that it was unsustainable. I mean, if you got three good starts from Chien-Ming Wang in an 11-game winning streak, that's not going to last.
Yeah, you should go buy a lottery ticket.
Honestly, as you look back on it, did you see the possibility of this thing falling apart when we got to Dunedin for spring training?
No.
You didn't?
Not in the way that it did.
Do you think you should have, though, Shai?
In hindsight, maybe, because the Blue Jays for the past few years have been relying on young guys, and they didn't have a lot of people with track records, particularly in the starting rotation. And then you come in and you see Burley and Dickey and Johnson and Morrow, and then either Romero and Happ, and you're like, all right, well, they've got a 6 who probably could be a 3 or a 4 on other rotations. And you're like, maybe the fact that they don't have that layer of AAA depth that they might need, maybe they're set to overcome that because they have guys who are going to give them 200 or in that area. And I strongly felt that Romero was going to bounce back, and he didn't. And you thought, okay, Brandon Morrow, even if he gives you 180, you're going to be fine. But to get as little as they did from Morrow and Johnson, and then have Romero be a complete non-factor the whole season, they just weren't able to sustain that.
Yeah, and I'm not gonna sit here. When you and I were down in Florida for those couple of weeks and sat there and did the show every day and talked to all the different guys, I'm not going to tell you that I had a sniff, but I should have. And a month into this season, I started looking back and saying, should I have seen some of this coming? Now, injuries, you don't expect Reyes to get hurt, and you don't expect Morrow to go down in the first 2 or 3 weeks or whatever it was. But there were some funny things that happened there. The Romero thing was a distraction and an event, a daily event, all of spring training. Hap was clearly unhappy about,
Absolutely.
the prospect of going down to Buffalo. He thought he deserved to be there under any circumstance. The club in denial all summer, or all camp, until the last, week or something, about what they were going to do with Romero.
Minor leaguers.
Yeah. Although that's only
and we
fifth
stood
start.
there. I don't remember. Were you there for that day, on that day?
I wasn't there that day.
Because I think you were there, weren't you? I was there. It was pretty bad. That it was against the Pittsburgh Pirates, like A guys and B guys, or double A guys. It was all those guys that went to the World Baseball Classic, and that opportunity to spend time together, and whether it's the double play combination at second or just getting to know the other guys, that didn't really happen. Aaron Sibia is gone. He's their number one catcher. He's not working with the pitchers. What's that going to mean early part of the season? Laurie goes down with the injury. In hindsight, there were a whole bunch of things, little things that we kind of don't worry about that because look at this. Don't worry about that one over there because we still have this. That maybe we should have paid attention to, huh?
Sure. And part of it is the belief that talent is going to overcome. And I was a strong backer in the belief that, chemistry maybe isn't that important or it's overstated and clubhouse dynamics are determined by whether a team wins or not. But, the past couple seasons have really turned my opinion on that, and the importance of that, of guys being together, guys being able to really not only have great talent, but to have great care and connections with their teammate. And, the World Baseball Classic was really a factor because, Jose Reyes and Edwin Encarnacion.
They're all gone for 3 weeks.
Right. I mean, they won it. The Dominican Republic
Yeah.
won it. So they were gone the longest. The Americans made it into the second round. And that's a great point about Aaron Sibia not being able to work with the pitchers because he was working with Dickey, a guy he ended up catching once all year.
Yeah.
And it took him and Burley a long time to get on the same page. And until they got on the same page, and John, you know this well, I mean, Burley wasn't able to be the same guy because Burley just likes to, look at the catcher sign and throw a pitch.
But with that as a possible, okay, I'll buy that. But none of that stuff. This is all hindsight. Obviously, we're looking back, and that plus the alleged country club atmosphere under John Gibbons, that didn't make the starting pitching crappy, and they lost because the starting pitching was crappy. That's 90% of it, isn't it?
Well,
and that is
some of it.
If you go back to Bob's point about Dickey being away, I don't know when he sustained that back problem or that neck problem.
Yep.
But certainly having to pitch, to get himself ready to pitch in such high pressure circumstances so quickly, might well have contributed to that early season injury. And he wasn't right for 2 months.
Yeah, no, I'll buy the fact that he wasn't healthy and he pitched through it. I think he had to figure out the dome. But I just, again, I'm still of that school that thinks all of those other things come out of winning rather than the other way around.
Sure.
9 times out of 10 or 99 times out of 100.
But the other contributing factor to that is it's easier when a group has a bit of a collective history together. And you had 12 or 13 new guys on the roster that didn't have any background with one another. And so they're trying to figure each other out, what they're all about. Hey, I can tease this guy, or this guy's thin-skinned, or, this guy's okay if I talk to him and this guy's not.
Mm-hmm.
And so as things are starting to spin out of control in April, you have a bunch of almost strangers, in a sense, trying to figure this thing out together. And so instead of being able to get to know each other in a more relaxed atmosphere, all of a sudden they're in a mode where they have to right the ship, and that's a pretty difficult
Oh,
circumstance.
and I'm with you there. And again, I think panic creeps in,
Sure.
and there's all kinds of things. And I think John Gibbons is getting used to these guys, but that didn't make Josh Johnson crappy.
No.
Right, and it didn't make Brandon Morrow fragile or whatever we want to think about his season. And those two things are way more important than how they reacted to adversity, I think.
Yeah, no.
It's it's half your rotation.
No, there's no doubt about it. Nobody's trying to diminish that, but there were other factors at play here. Another factor at play here: did Alex Anthopoulos make a mistake by not trying harder to get a legitimate second baseman? He had two guys that were sort of makeshift in Izturis and Bonifacio, who he had decided one of the two is going to play second base. Well, we're at spring training and we're watching Bonifacio at second base, and he's a complete and total stone finger out there. And Izturis winds up playing third base.
Because Laurie gets hurt.
Because Laurie gets hurt. And Bonifacio, most people, I remember when the trade was made, and we talked to some people that watched him in Florida, they said, well, really his best position is center field. So, I mean, there were all kinds of factors and things that were going on here, not the least of which I think we'd all concede is that the pitching staff went to hell in a handbasket. One of the most interesting parts of the book actually is in the first 25, 30 pages or so, as you document what happened during last offseason as Alex was going through the machinations of putting this team together. And I think people will be surprised by some of the revelations in here. How he got how the payroll had already been agreed. It was going to go to 105 under any circumstance.
That was the working number that he had as he started out on the offseason.
Yeah. And then as the Miami thing started to expand, if you will, and ultimately balloon, they went back to Nadir Muhammad, CEO of Rogers, and got some more money.
Yep. And
took it up to 120.
And the big thing in between that got them there was the attempt to get Jake Peavy. The difference being Jake Peavy would have been a one-year hit, and it would have taken them into the 120 area that they ended up at. But the Marlins deal had payroll commitments for the subsequent years.
Back end of the Reyes deal, the back end of the Burley deal,
exactly.
et cetera, right? Yeah.
Right. So, they're faced with, right now, they have $110 million in payroll commitments to about 13 players. So ownership had to make the decision that this is going to be sustained in the coming years, because you can't just say, okay, there's 110, we're going to stick at 120, figure it out.
No, you got to keep going up.
Right, because you got to make the 110 million, you got to support the $110 million.
Right.
So that was the key conversation. So PV opened the door to expanding that conversation, but the Marlins deal is what allowed them to make it a multi-year commitment that ownership was going to provide enough money to support that deal in the subsequent seasons.
Yeah, and it almost boxes them in. It's they've created a window now,
right,
in which they're almost compelled to do more because you have to take advantage of that window. You're locked into it, right?
Right, and in some ways that can be almost a bit more dangerous, right? So you think about the Angels 2 seasons ago, they make the deals for Pujols and C.J. Wilson, and they have a bit of a flawed team.
So they double down.
Right, but they've got to support that. So they get Josh Hamilton, and Josh Hamilton's not the answer. And now you've got a bunch of bad money on the books.
Mm-hmm.
And how do you correct that? And no one's going to take those contracts off your hands.
And the question now is, what is the answer?
Mm-hmm.
Well, we'll get to that in a second. I mean, one thing I'm interested in, and I'll throw this at you, John. Why did you guys decide to co-author this book as opposed to one of you just taking it on? You're laughing here.
Well, because the call, I had worked with Jack David in a previous incarnation, and Jack runs ECW Press, and he called me, and I said to myself, well, I can't cover the Blue Jays and write a book at the same time, and I said, what do you think of a co-author? And I told him who I had in mind before the person knew who I was thinking about, and he said, yeah, fine. So I asked Shai, and we were off to the races. I mean, it was there was no way that I could have.
So this was out of necessity.
Yeah. Plus, I think that we've been covering the Blue Jays probably for roughly the same amount of time. We know each other well. I think we've just based on our working relationship that we both had a good feeling that we would kind of complement each other in certain ways, and that's really how it worked out. I think.
Who was the assignment editor on this?
Wow, that was some of it kind of came naturally. It was the logistics are really hard even to go back and review. It just kind of happened in some cases. I think we sat down early and said, Shai did the off-season stuff.
Mm-hmm.
He did the bulk of that. I mean, some of it came from interviews that we both were involved in. Some of the interviews for the book we both were involved in. Some
was one of the other.
Was one of the other. And then we would write a chapter, or one of us would write a chapter, and the other guy would say, well, I got this from back here that will work
in there.
And so, yeah, I think it's a better product because of the two of us.
Who was the least cooperative member of the Toronto Blue Jays, Billy Beans? Player or management?
We were pretty fortunate.
Least.
We were pretty fortunate that anyone who we asked for a decent amount of time ended up giving it to us. I mean, it's a really good group of people. I don't know that really we had anyone who was especially difficult.
No, it was funny in spring training. This was a first for us. We had never done anything like this. And so in spring training, we talked to selected key people in the clubhouse and said, we're doing this.
Mm-hmm.
And from time to time, we might want to spend more than the usual 5 minutes with you.
Mm-hmm.
One of them was Ricky Romero. Who kind of gave us an odd look, as I recall, almost prescient.
What, as if he knew what was coming?
I don't know if he knew what was coming.
Don't worry, I won't be spending much time there.
And then I remember another player saying, "Well, what's in the club happens in the clubhouse stays in the clubhouse," and all that stuff. But I can't think of anyone who was uncooperative. Everybody talks to you with an agenda, with a spin.
Well, yeah, sure.
But
I just wonder whether somebody jumped up.
So the book ends with the rather sad scene of the lockers being cleaned out and the guys leaving and Darren Oliver going off to retirement and half these guys not already being gone. It kind of that's a familiar feeling. You've been around a losing team in the last game 162. They don't stick around and kiss each other. Where do they go from here? This is so at the moment after this book ends, where are they going?
That's really the challenge at this point because, up until last offseason, they'd been an organization that was gathering assets and was developing a farm system. And now, as we mentioned earlier, they're in a position where they have to sustain what they've got. But they don't have as many assets as they did the previous winter. It's going to be, for them to improve, they're probably going to have to flip some guys off their big league roster, whereas last year they didn't have to do that. They didn't want to do that. And I deep down, I don't think Alex wants to do that. But free agency, the money's going to get stupid, and I don't know if he's going to have enough money in his budget to go and get the impact guys that he needs in free agency.
Well, if we're talking about the Canoes and the McCanns and guys like that, the answer is almost certainly no.
Well, even if you look at the Tim Lincecum deal, where he got 35
that's
over
an
2.
Insane deal, though, isn't
right?
it?
But that's gonna push the market for someone like Irvin Santana up, and Irvin Santana is a guy who would make some sense for the Blue Jays. But where's his market going to go, and is that going to eat up all the available funds? So if you're not going to do it that way, you're back to trades, and already they don't have a ton of prospects at the upper level, which teams typically want. They're younger guys. You have to think about what's going to happen 4 or 5 years down the line. So you don't want to gut yourself there. So you're left with maybe flipping someone off your big league roster.
Well, unless you're willing to deal with a guy like Stroman, who is on, it was, again, would be a pretty good bet to be in the major leagues next year at some point, maybe even to start the season.
Right.
But then you're
hard to see that.
Well,
they didn't bring him up in September.
But no, I think
was more roster management.
Yeah, no, I think he's going to be there, and he's been pitching well in Arizona.
We saw him last year in spring training, and he's pretty explosive. Yeah.
What would you do with Josh Johnson?
You know what? After the Lincecum deal, I looked at that and said that might not be. Don't put yourself in a position where you have to compete with other teams. Lock them up.
The qualifying offer then?
Yeah.
Give him the 14?
I would consider it a lot more now than I would have before Lincecum.
Wow, high risk, huh?
Very, very high risk, but
huge.
You talk to enough of his former teammates, current teammates, and they're like, this doesn't make any sense at all.
And I don't know.
Yeah, I'm with you.
I'm skeptical. I mean, I remember after the Miami trade, going back to what you were saying earlier about the euphoria, I remember writing a story in which I listed the risks. And of course, one of them was Josh Johnson and his injury history. Now, Josh Johnson, a triceps injury in May or whenever it was, is not usually cause for alarm. But then he comes back with the quote unquote forearm injury, which is a euphemism for an elbow.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I remember asking him when he talked to us about this forearm injury, where does it hurt? Here.
Mm-hmm. You pointed to your elbow.
I pointed to my elbow, or he pointed to his elbow, and I just pointed to mine, right? And and so now you've got two injuries on the table for a guy who has an injury history. And
that's pretty scary.
Everybody says, when he's right, he's as good a pitcher as you will find. And we saw very brief flashes of that.
In the spring, certainly.
But man, $14 million? I don't know. They're
but it's 1 year, right? It's $14 million. It's off the books. And if not him, who?
Well, that's the dilemma, though.
Yeah.
I mean, that's you just hit on the real
Well,
issue.
do you sit back and think of, realistically
realistically
think a Draybeck or a Hutchison is going to crack your rotation?
Could.
Maybe Hutchison. Hutchison's pitching great in the Arizona Fall League for what that's worth. But the issue becomes with Johnson, you can take the control off the table. You control his destiny.
Right.
Whereas with the other free agents, already you have the issues of getting guys to come to Toronto. As silly as they are, for a lot of players, that's legitimate. Plus, you have the stigma of, all right, you got to compete in the American League East, and you've got to go to the team that was in last place. So you're not exactly selling yourself. You're not in a great position to say, oh, yeah, come, we're great. A lot of guys are going to be reluctant if they have better options to
and don't
to come
underestimate
and try to fix
the turf factor.
Yeah, which a lot of conversation about that, certainly after. I see the DeRosa quotes about it.
Sure.
I was on with Mike Wilner the other day. A lot of guys talking about how messed up they were, especially at the beginning of the season, guys who hadn't played on it. And that's not going to change. Not going to change for 2, 3, 4 years anyway.
Yeah, and guys are becoming more vocal, at least privately, in saying the toll that it takes on them over the course of the season, like how much it hurts their backs or their knees, the difficulty in the transition of coming off the road from McGrath and then getting back on that field. And it's not getting any better. It's only getting more and more compressed as it gets older. And that's really a tough problem. And I don't know if it's necessarily related to their injury woes the past 2 years, but perhaps it's a factor.
Now, your major league chips are Bautista. They're maybe, although great contract and
Right.
You did a lot of high risk. Rasmus, bullpen guys, right up to including Jansen.
Yeah.
Who are you willing? Who do you think? Forget about who you're willing to, but
They're going to have to.
It may. But do you think they would deal a Bautista? Do you think that they would deal a Rasmus and take a risk with handing the job over?
I wouldn't have thought a
To go
Bautista deal
somewhere.
was possible before this season, but he might be the guy who solves a couple things for you.
Exactly.
And if he doesn't solve if a trade for him doesn't solve at least a couple needs with significant upgrades, you don't do it. Right. But I mean, if you're other teams and you see Hunter Pence again from the Giants getting 18 over 5, and Hunter Pence is a great player, but he's not an $18 million player.
Well, he is now.
Right. and you have Jose Bautista for 3 years at 14.
That's a bargain. And everybody else will recognize it.
Exactly.
And they'll give you more because of that.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, it's a great contract. It's a owner-friendly contract. There's no question about that. But you're giving up 35 and 100 and plus defense, and
Right.
you got to fill that hole, right?
Yeah.
Exactly.